Good evening to all of you, and welcome to the second Bengal Club virtual talk. It's for those who were not there in the first talk, it's very similar to our in-person talks, except of course that it is not preceded by a sumptuous high tea at the club. The other difference is that you will be muted during the course of the talk to prevent background noise or of malfunctioning mics and speakers, the sound of all that creeping into the talk. At the end of the talk, there will be an usual question and answer session. You will need to type your questions in the chat box, which you will find at the bottom on the panel of your screen. I'll tell you more about it later when we come to that. Tonight, our speaker is Sudeep Chakravarti, an award-winning author of best-selling and critically acclaimed works of narrative nonfiction, including his latest book on which he will speak today, Plassey, The Battle That Changed the Course of Indian History. And also, of course, he has written The Bengalis, a portrait of a community, on which many of you might remember he spoke at the Bengal Club in 2018. He's also authored several works of fiction, including The Baptism of Tony Kalangute, a novel, Tinfish, and The Avenue of Kings, as well as several short stories. His work has been translated into various languages, including Bengali, Hindi, Tamil, Spanish, Portuguese, and German. An extensively published columnist, he has over three decades of experience in media, worked with major global and Indian media organizations, including the Asian Wall Street Journal, Sunday, the India Today Group, and HT Media. His interests include scuba diving and marine conservation, which I suppose is at least part of the reason for which he lives in a village in Goa, from where he will speak to us all tonight. Over to you, Sudeep.
Thank you, Sharajesh, for that very kind introduction, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to my home. That's the best I can do right now, and though I wish that we were at the Bengal Club, your club, for a very simple reason. The book that I've written recently, it's been published earlier this year, and about which I'm about to speak to you, and then I hope we have an interaction, is about the Battle of Plassey, and what better setting for it than the hall at which I spoke about the Bengalis 2 years ago. That lovely backdrop with the East India Company merchant shipping as a background, with, if I'm not wrong, Sharajesh, you could correct me, with a portrait of Raja Ram Mohan Roy on one side. I think that would have been a very apt setting, but I'm not complaining. I'm happy to be here again to join you and to discuss certain things that I feel very strongly about one of the most pivotal events in modern Indian history, ladies and gentlemen. And I strongly believe that that what today is modern India, or what we call modern India, the root of it, and in many cases what we are today, is directly derived from the Battle of Plassey, or the Battle of Polashi, and or Polashi Juddha, as we say it in Bangla. And the reason I say it is that we could easily be having this conversation in French, as I like to say, because the French were very key competitors in the Indian subcontinent around the time that the British East India Company also was. We mustn't forget that. French were an extremely powerful influence in the Indian subcontinent against the British, and almost won the war for the domination of the subcontinent, for Bengal, and which would have led to its victory in Plassey. Alas, we could have had this conversation in Marathi as well, because in the time period that we're talking about, the mid 18th century, or even the beginning of the 18th century, the Marathas were the most rampaging and rampant military and political force in the entire subcontinent, far exceeding the influence of the Mughals, who were at that point of time really sort of figureheads for a crumbling empire. And I think this is a good entry point, if you will, for me to.
1 second, very sorry to interrupt, Sudeep. Rudrangshuda cannot hear you, and so if you could just increase your volume a little bit. Very sorry for this interjection.
No, that's all right. Is this better?
Yes, it is better.
All right. If that is Rudrangshuda, I'm deeply honored if he is part of this discussion, because I'm honored that he took the time to read my book and said very kind things about it. I'm deeply grateful for that. He's a historian I admire and I respect, and it means a lot to me that you are here, Rudrangshuda. Thank you very much. And as we say sometimes, Gustaki Maaf, I can't outdo you. I can barely match you and your expertise. If I do make an error from time to time, I shall try to clear it up as soon as possible. But at that point, let me carry on and make and share with you, ladies and gentlemen, so how I will approach this brief comment that I will make, after which I hope you will join me in having a conversation, is that I would take you through very briefly a broad brush of what the Indian subcontinent was at that point of time, so that you have the context for the Battle of Plassey, and also the context for the political and economic necessities in Bengal at that point of time, which also led to the Battle of Plassey. And I'm going to be focusing this evening not to take you in detail through all the mechanics, but primarily to maybe even provoke you to some extent by talking about what I like to call the various myths related to the Battle of Plassey. There are several enduring and lamentable myths, in my opinion, which need to be addressed more and more. And I have tried to address some of them in my book, and I will try to address some of them in our conversation tonight. So, very briefly, early 18th century Bengal, 18th century India, or mid 18th century India. It begins actually with the weakening of the Mughal Empire during, ironically, at its peak when Emperor Aurangzeb was the emperor of the Mughals. And it began during his reign, when you had the tearaway chieftain Shiva, or Shiv, who is more respectably referred to as Shivaji or Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj, for the absolutely for the great fans of it. But this chieftain was actually threatening Mughal domination, Mughal rule in central and western India. And what, in a way, Shivaji started sort of snowballed began to snowball, gather momentum towards the end of Aurangzeb's rule, and certainly by the time Aurangzeb passed on in 1707. By that time, you had the Mughal Empire had begun to resemble almost a paper empire, if you will, which I sort of somewhat rudely call a paper farman operation, if you will. And after Aurangzeb, you had a series of increasingly weaker emperors, many of them controlled by very powerful viziers or ministers and courtiers in Delhi. I can't even begin to call it Byzantine, and I would like to call it was very Delhi-like. I mean, it was so, it has its own rhythm, it has its own conspiracies. And not just the Marathas were keen on taking over, if you will, making the power play in the Indian subcontinent. The Sikh chieftaincies of present-day Punjab were breaking away. The Bundelkhand, the Rohillas were breaking away to the east and southeast of Delhi. The Nizam of Hyderabad was, for all practical purposes, independent. And so also the increasingly independent Nawabs of Bengal, beginning with the Subadar, Murshid Quli Khan, the Subadar of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa, who, for all practical purposes, became, like the Nizam of Hyderabad, an autonomous governor, an autonomous Nawab, and called the first independent Nawab, if you will, of Bengal. And that was essentially the political framework in which you had the Europeans coming into play as well for economic and benefit, and as often as they could, political benefit, which would immediately parlay into economic benefit. It was a sort of a circle, if you will. And in that, you had the British East India Company, you had the French East Indies Company, a very, very strong force in this Indian subcontinent at the point of time. You had the lesser force of the Portuguese, you had the relatively lesser force of the Dutch. They did become quite powerful in the 1740s, 1750s. We'll come to that a little later. And you had the relatively benign Danes. And the Germans came into play very, very briefly, but nobody really cared for them, and they got thrown out of Bengal and India very, very quickly. And these companies looked at the Indian subcontinent, as you very well know, as a commercial enterprise and a political enterprise. And one of the myths that I would like to break at this particular point of time, ladies and gentlemen, is the separation of the company and the crown, or the separation of the company of these various companies and the countries that they came from, if you will. They didn't represent the countries, but the governments of these respective countries were very keen as to what these various companies, the East India Company of the British, the French, the Dutch, the Danes, were doing in the Indian subcontinent, indeed in many other parts of Asia and the world. So it was a crown and company project, as I like to call it, from the get-go. Don't forget, ladies and gentlemen, that when when you had Sir Thomas Roe as the ambassador in Emperor Jahangir's court, he was actually there on behalf of the crown, but he was negotiating for a company. Let's begin with that confluence, that conjoining of crown and company from the very beginning in the Indian subcontinent. It's nothing surprising. It happens in the present day. Business and politics are handmaidens to each other. So it's not surprising, and nothing new to all of us this evening, I'm sure. So you had this particular situation, and Bengal was at that point of time, and there were other particular forces that were affecting the Indian subcontinent, and also will end up affecting Bengal and build this run-up to Plassey, if you will. Very briefly, you had the French and the British jockeying for supremacy in southern India. The jockeying for power, for economic supremacy or economic control and political control, if you will, began in southern India, not in Bengal. In Bengal, it came somewhat later. It was an effect of what happened in southern India. You had the French, led by the governor who was based in Pondicherry, which was the headquarters of the French, not Chandannagar, but Pondicherry, a governor called Dupleix, who made a major power play, an absolute power play for economic betterment of the company, the French East Indies Company, and for political control, influence in the Carnatic, by offering his services, if you will, to the powers in the region. And he hoped, by offering his services, by playing one against the other, he would curry favor and would gain political benefit to the company and to France, and certainly gain economic benefit by enhanced rights to trade, enhanced territories in which they could trade from, commercial benefits would accrue to them. It was a very simple business enterprise. And the British were part of that as well. They were watching the French move very, very closely. And at that point of time, the British East India Company was based in Fort St. George in Madras. Calcutta was not the premier or the leading center at that particular point of time. Calcutta became the capital of British India only in 1773. Madras was the key presidency, if you will, at that point of time. So the British and the French were keeping a very close watch on each other. And then in the 1740s, you had the Austrian War of Succession break out in Europe, in which the British and the French were ranged on opposite sides. And the competition in Europe also played into competition in North America, played into political and economic competition in the Caribbean, played into the economic and political competition in the East Indies, and most certainly in the Bay of Bengal area, the Arabian Sea area, i.e. the Indian subcontinent. And British and French actually fought a war. Dupleix, with the help of the governor of Mauritius, a gentleman called Labordonnais. If you visit Pondicherry, these names will, you will see these names as street names. They actually attacked Fort St. George and took it over with the tacit agreement of the Nawab of Arcot at that point of time, a gentleman called Anwaruddin, with the understanding that they would kick the British out and they would share the spoils of Fort St. George. It didn't quite work out like that. And there's a reason why I'm talking about this. And then when the Nawab of Arcot felt betrayed, or the deal reneged upon by Dupleix, the governor, the French governor, the Nawab of Arcot actually sent his son, Mahfouz Khan, to attack Fort St. George and wrest it from the French. The French counterattacked, and this is known famously, this battle, which played out in October of 1746, is known famously as the Battle of Santon, or the Battle of Mylapore, or the Battle of Adyar. And the forces of the Nawab of Arcot were routed by a relatively small but extremely efficient and quite clever French forces. And that sent out a signal, a significant signal to the French and to the British who were watching, that the European forces could take on and defeat the Moors of the Indian subcontinent. So in many ways, and this battle was in some ways is regarded as a trailer to the Battle of Plassey, where an increasingly confident European powers could see, could take the template of what happened in southern India and try and template and bring it, be more and more confident of their economic plays, their political plays in the Indian subcontinent. And this, this sort of this sort of Anglo-French animosity, if you will, ladies and gentlemen, carried on to Bengal. And the other force at that point of time were the Marathas, who were a tearaway force, and they were rampaging across northern India, west and central India, of course, many parts of southern India, and they came east all the way to Bengal at a time when Siraj-ud-Dowla's grandfather, Alibardi Khan, was the Nawab of Bengal, the Subadar of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. And Alibardi Khan had to treat with the Marathas and cede the province of Orissa to the Marathas, and also offer up what is called the chauts, which is what the Marathas wanted in the first place, was basically 1/4 the revenue of the Bengal provinces, which they wanted. So Alibardi Khan was compelled to treat with the Marathas. And how close did they come? If you go to Murshidabad today and stand across the river from Hazarduari Palace on the opposite bank of the Bhagirathi River, within sight of the Hazarduari Palace, you will see a temple to Eklinji Maharaj established by the Marathas and in Devanagari, in Nagari script, and is propitiated by a devotee who's a Maratha. That's how close they came to us speaking in Marathi this evening, or perhaps me writing my book in Marathi. And everybody wanted the wealth of Bengal. That is the bottom line, really. Everybody really wanted the wealth of Bengal, not just the British, not just the French, not just the Danes, not just the Dutch, but equally people who were of the Indian subcontinent. The Mughals wanted it, which is why they came to Bengal in the first place. The Pathans and Afghans and the Turks before them did. The Marathas most certainly did, as we discussed briefly. And everybody was in the play of Bengal, an exceedingly wealthy province, a hub of trade, a very easy place to do trade. Finance was easily available. In Calcutta, you had the Armenians, it was a melting pot like all the presidency towns in India. You had the Armenians, you had people from all over Europe, you had merchants from all over Central Asia in Bengal and upriver in the Hooghly, in these trading towns of Calcutta, of Hooghly, of Chinsura, of Chandannagar, and right up to Murshidabad, where south of Murshidabad you have these enclaves in Qasim Bazar or Qasim Bazar and Kalikapur, where the Dutch were, and so on and so forth. And Bengal was, it had jute, it had fabric, it had silk, it had cottons, It had saltpeter within its ambit. It had jaggery. It had lac. It had, I mean, you name it. Bengal had really everything that the world was looking for at that time. And it was a natural place to come. As I said, finance was easily available. Not just the Jagat Seths of the world who were interested in, who actually had the kabza, if you will, of the Bengal Nawabship, because they were the court mandated treasurers to the Bengal government at that point of time. But over and above the Jagat Seths, who had enormous influence and were key players in the Plassey conspiracy and the Plassey story, the fact is that it was a thriving mercantile hub, Calcutta, since its establishment in 1690, and also upriver, the sort of the river sutra, if you will, ladies and gentlemen, of Bengal, the Hooghly Bhagirathi, which extended all the way from the mount of the Gangetic Delta right up to Murshidabad and further north, with the canal system that linked it to the Greater Ganga and then to to Patna and further west onto Delhi. And of course, it was linked with Eastern Bengal to Dhaka and so on and so forth. So it was a thriving hub, and everybody wanted in on the action. And here, I think I should get into some of the myths of Plassey, to my mind. One key myth was, I addressed one myth earlier on, which was that, you know, the sort of supposition that it was the East India Company, the British East India Company. When I say John Company or company now, I mean primarily the British company. If I'm referring to any other company, I will take their names specifically. That it was the British historians, or the sort of the pro-crown historians, or the company historians, Macaulay, you name it, even a crown historian, if I may be so bold as to say, like Neeraj C. Chaudhary, would say that, would whitewash the whole episode and claim that it was all to do with the company and the crown had nothing to do with it, which to my mind, ladies and gentlemen, is a lot of nonsense, because it was, as I will detail to you, it was a crown and company project right through, one backed up the other when the time came. And I will detail as to how. The second, because the second myth that I would like to address is that Siraj-ud-Dowlah was an extremely rude man who single-handedly insulted the British and is single-handedly responsible for offending the British East India Company and inviting their wrath onto Calcutta and further up, and precipitating the Battle of Plassey on entirely by himself, which again is incorrect to my mind, because if you look at history, and this is not me speaking as a Bengali person or a Bengali historian or a Bengali nationalist historian or even an Indian nationalist historian, but as a person who looks at evidence presented. And here I'm quoting all sorts of sources, including company sources, which tell me that from the time of the Mughal times, the Aurangzeb times, in the 1680s, when Shaista Khan was the governor of Bengal, many decades before Siraj-ud-Dowlah became Nawab in 1756, after the death of his grandfather Ali Wardi Khan. In 1680s, Job Charnock, who is credited with the establishment of Calcutta and the Calcutta as the town, was a factor, the chief of the British factory in Qasim Bazar or Qasim Bazar, and he ran into trouble with Shaista Khan, which led Shaista Khan to actually attack the British factory in Qasim Bazar, arrest factors over there. Job Charnock escaped downriver towards Calcutta, and then the British East India Company embarked on an absolutely foolhardy mission by trying to teach the Mughals a lesson and try to attack Chittagong port by saying that we will take over this fabulously well-sheltered port in the eastern seaboard of the Bay of Bengal. And the Mughals absolutely hammered the British expeditionary force, if I may call it that. And they, with their bloodied noses, went away. And it took Shaista Khan's departure as governor of Bengal in 1688 for the British to come back to try and get into the good books of the Mughals and the Bengal Nawabs, if you will, and then work their way back and gain a concession to establish, to buy land from the Suvarna Raichaudhuris and the Banik families and other landlords from Govindapur, of Sutanati, and so on and so forth, and establish the base. So Murshid Quli Khan, who became Nawab at the time of the Emperor Farrukhsiyar, who is called the Nawab of Bengal, the first independent Nawab of Bengal, he had run-ins with the company. His son had run-ins with the company, Shujauddin. Sarfaraz, the grandson, had run-ins with the company. When they were deposed by Alivardi Khan and Alivardi's Khan dynasty took over, he had run-ins with the company. They all did. In fact, they were threatening each other all the time. It was business as usual. The British would say, "Oh, we will shut down the factory and we will pull out if you don't give in to our concessions." And they would push them as hard as they could, stretch the limit, and then come to a compromise, because it was all about trade. It was all about beneficial trade from which the Bengal government would earn its duties. They would not just duties from the British company, which at that point of time was duty free, but there was sort of accessory trading that happened. Bengal, it would benefit Bengal trade. The British, the Nawabs of Bengal had their own private trades, which they used British agents, Armenian agents, so on and so forth to deal with. And so it was sort of they would come to a compromise. Now, Siraj is not, I mean, let me say that when Siraj was actually appointed heir to Alivardi in the early 1750s, the company actually met him, Siraj, the heir apparent in Hooghly, and in Hooghly town, and offered him tremendous amounts of gifts to propitiate the present prince and the future Nawab of Bengal. And Siraj, in turn, offered sort of kind words back to the company. So they were friends for a while. And how did this ratchet up into this grand animosity over time? Let me explain, try and break this other myth for you at this point of time, which is that he invited the Plassey conspiracy, and the British, by upsetting the British and by upsetting everybody, Siraj was a sitting duck. He gave Bengal away to the British, and so on and so forth. The fact is that Siraj wasn't, the British weren't the only ones trying to conspire. Indeed, what happened in the 1750s is that you had the other edition of the sort of the Anglo-French tension building up in India, when the 7 Years' War broke out in Europe, and there was imminent hostilities, and the French and the British were very aware of it, and they were preparing for it, and they were watching each other's power plays in the Carnatic and in Bengal, to the extent that the French were absolutely ready that the so-called neutrality of the Ganges, by which the British and the French had agreed to not fight with each other in Bengal and up and down the Hooghly, it was an agreement, it was not a treaty, that they would break it. And Robert Clive, actually in 1756, actually urged the defeat of the French in Bengal, and he was one of the prime movers to break the neutrality of the Ganges before actually attacking Chandannagar and demolishing the French on his way to Plassey. So you had this Anglo-French, the second edition of the Anglo-French tension building up, in which they were looking at Bengal as a territory which they had to protect their interests in, political and economic interests in, right? So you had that happen. Alongside what you had, again, this is not usually appreciated, is that the British were not the first people to conspire against Siraj, or Robert Clive was not the first person to conspire against Siraj-ud-Daulah with Mir Jafar, with Ghaseti Begum, Siraj's aunt, with the Jagat Seth Madhav Rai at that point of time, and his cousin, the Maharaja Swarup Chand, not the first to conspire with Rai Durlabh Ram, who was a key co-conspirator as well, not the first to conspire with the great merchant Uma Chand in Calcutta, more of him later. the fact is that even before Siraj became Nawab, there was an active force among the Murshidabad elite against Siraj. These names that I've taken, primarily Mir Jafar, Ghasiri Begum, Siraj's aunt, and Jagat Seth, were actually conspiring to ensure, Ghasiri Begum and Mir Jafar foresaw, that Siraj's cousin, first there was an attempt to get Siraj's younger brother, Mir Mehdi, Ikram Abdullah, who was adopted by Ghasiri Begum, actually, coincidentally. She wanted him to be her adoptive son, Siraj's younger brother, to be the next Nawab of Bengal. That poor boy died early, and the aunt was heartbroken, and she hated Siraj and conspired to have Siraj's cousin, Shaukat Jung, who was then in Purnia, brought in as the Nawab of Bengal. So you had, in 1756, you had a situation where Mir Jafar, Ghasiri Begum, and the grandees of Murshidabad actually getting together and approaching Shaukat Jung to bring him to effect a coup against Siraj, when in May 1756, Shaukat Jung actually begins to bring his army towards Murshidabad. Siraj ad-Dawla, in retaliation, moves his army towards Purnia. His cousin chickens out, writes Siraj ad-Dawla a propitiatory note, retreats to Purnia. End of conspiracy for the moment. Do you see what I'm saying? So it is not that Robert Clive at this time, Robert Clive was nowhere in the picture. You had a gentleman called William Watts, who was the chief representative in the British factory in Qasim Bazar, who was leading the main battle, if you will, for company interests in Murshidabad, in the court, and in Bengal. So he was actually conspiring with the disaffected elements in court, trying to reach Siraj ad-Dawla, and trying to keep the French away. That was William Watts, not Robert Clive. And William Watts was answering directly to the Select Committee of the British East India Company in Calcutta, not Robert Clive. Now, so this tension began to build up. And then Siraj becomes, at Ali Bardi's death, Siraj becomes a Nawab. And here you had Siraj ad-Dawla getting increasingly upset with the situation where there was flagrant misuse of the dastak that the British East India Company had received from the Emperor Farrukhsiyar to conduct duty-free trade in Bengal. And company executives were misusing the dastak by sort of doing the private trade and also subcontracting the dastak, if you will, subletting the dastak to Indian traders and other merchants. And that meant direct loss of revenue for the Bengal treasury, one. Two, you had a situation where the 7 Years' War was becoming a reality, and the British had decided, the company reps in Calcutta had decided to fortify Fort William to the extent possible, the southernmost aspect of the British on the Hooghly, and built entrenchments, built fortifications, try and beef up the fortifications in Qasim Bazar around the factory, so on and so forth. Siraj ad-Dawla didn't like it one bit. And he sent representations to the company, which were seriously and rudely rebuffed. And you had this tension building up. And when word went out that the company had some play in the play with Shaukat Jung coming towards him, and so on and so forth, and the British wouldn't listen to him, the company wouldn't listen to him, Siraj actually sent word to Murshidabad, even on his way back to Murshidabad from his campaign in Purnia, to get his army ready to march upon Calcutta. So Siraj ad-Dawla marches on Calcutta in June of 1756 to kick the British out of Calcutta, avowedly. And that's exactly what happened. And he ironically brings along his generals with him, Mir Jafar, Rai Durlab Ram, and all the rest with him to the campaign in Calcutta, gets rid of, has a skirmish. Calcutta falls after a day and a half of battle. On June 20th, 1756, Fort William is completely overrun. The governor of Fort William, Roger Drake, runs away. leaving this gentleman called John Zephaniah Holwell, a surgeon, as effectively the leader of the remaining forces in Fort William. Everybody capitulates, and in the night of 20th and the morning of 20th, June 21st, is that famous and deeply contentious event known, ladies and gentlemen, as the event of the Black Hole of Calcutta, which was an enclosure in the old Fort William in Calcutta, which is north of the present-day GPO in Calcutta, as many of you will know, which is now demolished, of course, but that is where the old Fort William was. And that was used as a moral underpinning to reclaim Calcutta, to depose Siraj-ud-Daulah, to take over Bengal, and to implant the flag of the Union Jack, not only for the company, but also for the crown in Bengal, and then thereafter the company. But people forget that, and this is the other myth, ladies and gentlemen, that when the British were camped, when they escaped downriver to a place called Falta, which is south, which is south of Bajbaj, actually, and that became the sort of the British headquarters in exile, if you will, and from where word went out to the Madras presidency to that we are in danger, we have been thrown out, we need to reclaim Calcutta and our interests in Bengal, otherwise the French will take it from us. This is too crucial for our trade, subcontinental trade. The preparations for the expedition to Calcutta, which took place in Madras, and of which Robert Clive became the part and became the land force commander of a joint force of Crown forces and company forces, which embarked towards Calcutta in October 1756, along with a naval force, also a joint naval force of the Crown and company. They left for Calcutta to basically win back Calcutta, to treat with Siraj-ud-Daulah, with the Nawab of Bengal. There was no talk of the Black Hole of Calcutta at that point of time. The Black Hole of Calcutta was a myth that took shape many years after the Battle of Plassey, when John Zephaniah Holwell woke up from his stupor, if you will, and then offered several versions of what transpired that night, which led even the British historians at that point of time, including company historians, company chroniclers, to question the veracity of Holwell's versions and question the number of people who had died in the Black Hole of Calcutta. In fact, not 146, many say 27 died. 27 is still a bad number. People died. There were men and women who died that night. So let's not dismiss it, but it was not quite the event perhaps that it was made out to be. And we need to remember that the Black Hole of Calcutta was truly born in the British mind after Plassey, not in the run-up to Plassey. The expeditionary force went to Calcutta to recover Calcutta. It was a business enterprise. It was a military enterprise and a business enterprise. When Clive and Co., I use the Clive and Company, then retook Calcutta from, by then Siraj-ud-Daulah had gone away to Murshidabad, and Clive and Company retook Calcutta in the first week of January 1757 with relatively less effort, if you will, and loss of lives and damage on either side. Siraj's forces, unfortunately, they left Calcutta and sort of went upriver to Hooghly and further back. Siraj-ud-Daulah actually came back. This is yet another myth. Not many people know that Siraj-ud-Daulah and Robert Clive's forces actually fought a skirmish in North Calcutta across the so-called Maratha ditch around Omichand's garden and that region of North Calcutta before Plassey. Battle of Plassey was not the first encounter of the Bengal forces, or actually the Siraj's forces and Clive forces directly led by Robert Clive, which actually led to a stalemate, which led to the Treaty of Alinagar on 9th of February, when Siraj-ud-Daulah, strangely enough, even though he had superior forces and position, decided to give back all the Fort William, all the concessions that the company had in Bengal to the status quo ante, the time before June 1756. And then, and here I'm going to slowly wrap up my curtain raiser, if you will, and then get into the interactive stage of the of our talk. And then uh, and then they treated, and after which, it was really after that that the conspiracy began to take shape, because Clive and the company saw that the French influence had begun to increase. The French were treating with Siraj ud-Dawla, who was not a fool, nobody's fool. He was trying to counterbalance the British and the French. And the British took a very cold, calculating call, led by Robert Clive, to attack Chandanagar, demolish Chandanagar, move upriver, take over the fort in Katwa, which is south of Plassey. Then, and in the meantime, the conspiracy, the so-called Plassey conspiracy, began to take shape with the old conspirators in Murshidabad from about April, May 1757. That's when it began to solidify. And when the conspiracy was signed and sealed in the third week of May 1757. So it was not a long, it didn't take long to come. It happened, sort of boom, 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 boom. It happened very, very quickly in relative terms. So, I mean, that's not many, I mean, we don't seem to pay attention to these details. And if I may, Sarojit, if you don't mind, and ladies and gentlemen, if you don't mind, I'll stop with one last myth breaking. And after that, I will address the questions that you have at the top of your minds. And I think we will then be able to unravel other interesting aspects of the Battle of Plassey and the overall event of Plassey, if you will. And here I'm reading from my book, Plassey, and in the myth that I'm referring to is directly leads me to the enduring myth that Clive Baron Plassey, the Lion of India, the heaven-sent general, as he was described by William Pitt the Elder or William Pitt the Younger, it escapes my mind right now, do forgive me, and that he had everything organized, that this opium addict, nervous wreck, foolhardy, reckless, but extremely brave and crafty military mind, Robert Clive, with a very keen mercantile sense as well, had everything under his control. The fact is that he did not. So on 2 days before the battle, which took place on 23rd of June, 1757, Robert Clive writes this letter, this note to Mir Jafar, who is to become, by this common agreement in the conspiracy, the next Nawab of Bengal, after Siraj ud-Dawla is deposed. And friends, this is the note that Robert Clive, the Lion of Bengal and India, and etc., writes to Mir Jafar. I am determined to risk everything on your account, though you will not exert yourself. I shall be on the other side of the river this evening. Here, by river, he means the Bhagirathi Hooghly across Plassey, which is to the west of the Plassey battlefield. If you will join me at Plassey, I will march halfway to meet you. Then the whole Nawab's army will know I fight for you. Give me leave to call to your mind how much your own glory and safety depends upon it. Be assured, if you do this, you will be Subha of these provinces. But if you cannot go even this length to assist us, I call God to witness, the fault is not mine. And I must desire your consent for concluding a peace with the Nawab. And what has passed between us will never be known. What can I say more than that I'm as desirous of your success and welfare as my own? Imagine, ladies and gentlemen, that 2 days before the Battle of Plassey, which changed the complexion of Bengal and of India subsequently, Robert Clive was so nervous and so unsure of the help of the conspirators in Murshidabad that he writes this note. And this is another myth, enduring myth. And this note is from company records, very diligently maintained East India Company records that I'm quoting to you from, not Indian nationalist historian sources. And to the extent that hours before the Battle of Plassey, there's no surety as well. He writes again to Mir Jafar, hours, just bare hours before the battle, which began on 23rd of June, 1757 at 8 a.m. in the morning. And he writes this note, whatever could be done by me, this is Clive again to Mir Jafar, whatever could be done by me, I have done. I can do no more. if you will come to Daudpur, I will march from Plassey to meet you. Daudpur is a village north of the battlefield of Plassey, between Plassey and Murshidabad. I will march from Plassey to meet you, but if you will not, if you won't comply even with this, pardon me, I shall make it up with the Nawab. So here again, ladies and gentlemen, here you have Robert Clive treating with a key conspirator, saying that he will make up with Siraj-ud-Dawla even hours before the Battle of Plassey takes place. He's threatening, he's whining, he's pleading for resistance. And again, the point here, and here I will close my comments and move to the next stage of the domino effect of the Battle of Plassey, is that it was all for the sake of company. Robert Clive put his career on the line for this. The council, the Calcutta Select Committee were not comfortable. They backed him, but they basically put the entire responsibility on Clive's head. That if it works out, excellent. But if it goes south, if it's a disaster, then it's all on you. It's your responsibility. So Clive was carrying that burden, and this throw of the dice was done with his career in mind and the company's career in Bengal and India in mind. And Clive was, which ironically led him to conspire with the conspirators in Murshidabad, and equally ironically, led him to think to the last minute, to the last hours, that he would treat with Siraj-ud-Dawla to again protect his interest and the company's interest. So it was really a business situation. It was a military call. It was a militaristic call, and it was a business call as well, which is not often appreciated. That the Plassey incident and the Battle of Plassey and its prelude and its aftermath is essentially a mercantile, militaristic enterprise. That is the thing. And maybe here, if our friend at the Bengal Club, would kindly bring up the map of the battlefield of Plassey, I would like you, ladies and gentlemen, to absorb that map for a few seconds and a minute while Sir Rajesh reads through whatever questions you may have, and we can get into that stage. And I would like to actually keep this map in front of us as we answer some of the questions. Maybe the map will help trigger some of the questions, and in between questions, I might even, I would like to actually explain to you the schematics of the Battle of Plassey, how it played out, and again, break some more myths as we go on in our conversation and interaction this evening. So if we could kindly have, if you could please have that map up, and if Sarajesh could kindly look at the questions that come in.
Gurudash has the image of the map. Gurudash, if you can put up the map, and Sudeep, if I understood you correctly, you want that map to be on the screen while members ask questions, right?
Well, I would like the map be a sort of a midway sort of an interlude, if you will, where because this is, after all, we've reached the stage where the battle is about to begin. We're in that part of our chronology in this evening's interaction. So maybe it's an apt moment for the map to come on screen, where people can see the map.
Yes.
Our guests
but
can see the map.
Tell me, right. I still see a black screen in front of me which says that Gurudash Mitra has started screen sharing. I don't actually see the map. But please tell me when you would like to take members' questions.
We can begin now. And actually, as this is a flexible format, if it's all right with you, ladies and gentlemen, let's not be too rigid. We can take a question, and when the map comes on, and then we can go back and forth, if that is all right with you, ladies and gentlemen.
Yes, yes. Shudipa Bose has a question. The vilification of Shiraj is reminiscent of the same as Richard III. Not sure that's a question, but Bashav Rai Chaudhary has another question. How did the Nawabs get along with the other European powers?
Okay, may I take that question now? I will refer to the lady's question first. Well said. And when people also, and maybe it is a good point to add that, you know, the sort of the Orientalists or the company, there we have the map. So while we have this, when I reply to you to these 2 points and questions, maybe all of us can then also begin to absorb the map that is in front of you, which I will come to after I answer these 2 points and questions. As to the lady's point, indeed, and which brings me to this sort of very quick dismissal, if you will, or questioning
Could you
of
please
the
speak
claim.
closer to the mic?
Yes,
Not
which brings me to the which brings me immediately to the to question the sort of the Western or the company's claim that the East India Company and the British did India a favor by getting rid of debauched sort of debauched, leery men who all they did was sort of spend their days smoking hashish and opium and making love to hundreds of concubines. We forget that you had Louis XIV not too far, not too distant from this chronology. We forget that you have the gentleman called Henry VIII in Britain, not too far from this chronology. We have this absolutely rapacious counts and kings in the German kingdoms, in the Germanic, the Teutonic kingdoms, the Dutch overlordships in Scandinavia. We are forgetting Spain and Portugal, and which had absolutely degenerate rulers at that particular point of time. So I think we need to, so madam, if you say Richard II, pick all your Shakespearean heroes, I'm with you all the way. I think it is sort of, as I tried to explain, I think Siraj got what the Americans would call a bum rap from the company's sources and overexcited historians who, even like Ghulam Hussain Tabatabai, who wrote this fabulous and interesting book called the Siyar al-Mutakirin, which I referred to. But it was, after all, written after Plassey, when in the post-Siraj times, and he was naturally anti-Siraj and praised all the other Nawabs of Bengal and what followed from Plassey. And as to the other question, Sir Rajesh, please take me back. I lost my thread here.
Yeah, no, I'll read it out to you. And there are quite a lot of questions, so we might want
but I will, for decency's sake, I think I should answer that question.
Of course. The question from Mr. Bashav Raishodri was, how did the Nawabs get along with the other European powers?
Well, actually, they got along rather well. The Nawabs of Bengal were business-minded people, including Siraj-ud-Dowla. So from the time of Murshid Quli Khan, and the Nawabs that followed, two Nawabs that followed after Murshid Quli Khan, then Ali Bardi Khan, then Siraj. Let me stop it to that series of Nawabs for the moment. They tried to extract maximum benefit from the European powers in Bengal. They saw very clearly that that a healthy economy, or as healthy an economy as possible, as healthy a trading environment as possible, was good for everybody, good for the people of Bengal. They didn't need to be taxed too highly, which was absolutely destroyed after the Battle of Plassey. We'll come to that very shortly. And they were trying to extract as much benefit from that as possible. All the Nawabs of Bengal and their families, including Siraj's mother, for instance, Amina Begum, conducted private trade. Amina Begum had a flourishing private trade in saltpeter, with which she treated she handled through the Armenian merchants, like Khoja Wajid and others out of Calcutta and out of Hooghly and other places. So it was to everybody's benefit that trade in Bengal kept to as positive a level as it could. And in that, they were jockeying for position naturally. You had the French, you had the British, you had the Danes, and you had the Dutch, who actually got a little carried away. And actually, after the Battle of Plassey, ironically, made a power play to get rid of the British from the chessboard of Bengal. And that there was a Battle of Chinsura in 1759, which the Dutch lost, and which also led to the deposing of Mir Jafar. But here I'm getting a little ahead of myself. The short point is that it was in everybody's interest to trade as effectively as possible. The one thing that the British were upset with the Nawabs of Bengal for a long time is their patronage of the bankers to Bengal, if you will, the family of the Jagat Seths and their cousins, who also got titles of the Maharajas. The banking family of the Seths, because the Seths control the treasury of Bengal, they also control the mint of Bengal, and the East India Company wanted to establish their own mint. They also wanted, and that even though they got permission from the Mughal court, the Seths, through the backing of the Nawabs of Bengal, steadfastly managed to deny them. So that was one major bugbear they had. But overall, it was not too unhappy a situation till the geo-economic and geopolitical imperatives led by primarily the Anglo-French animosities began to develop, and the Maratha animosities in the power play began to develop. The crumbling Mughal empire power plays began to develop, and the ratcheting up of the sort of the conspiracies and the animosity against Shiraj and Murshidabad began to develop. When all these disparate forces began to coalesce, ergo, you had the setting for what became the Battle of Plassey.
The next question from Mr. Monish Dutt. Please explain the role of Jagat Seth in the financing of Clive at Plassey, which you have done to some extent right now. And I just want to add on a little question of my own to this, which is that in Dalrymple's The Anarchy,
I knew you would bring this up. I knew you would refer to this, but go ahead. Thank you for doing this.
he almost implies that Mir Jafar was a puppet, and the puppeteer was in fact Jagat Seth. So if you could, if you want to add anything to what you have already said.
Well, William is not entirely incorrect, but he, I think, does too much credit to many sources and many events related to the Battle of Plassey and the Plassey events, to which I disagree with him quite respectfully, including the fact that he thinks that the Battle of Plassey wasn't really a big deal. I vehemently disagree with William on that count, but more on that a little later. About the Jagat Seth family, the bankers to Bengal, they were influential during the dynasties, during the sort of the Murshid Quli dynasty, if you will, and were very upset with the Murshid Quli Khan's grandson, who actually insulted the Jagat Seth at that time, Fateh Chand, and Fateh Chand's son, my apologies. And there was a scandalous event which involved the Jagat Seth's, I mean, a daughter of the Seth family, who was betrothed, and this Nawab of Bengal wanted to take a sneak peek at her. There was a huge scandal, and they were mortified. So goes the story. And he actually, the Jagat Seths actually organized a coup using Ali Vardi Khan, if you will, pressuring Ali Vardi Khan or assisting Ali Vardi Khan, who was already upset with this Nawab of Bengal, to overthrow him and then take over the Nawabship. The same thing happened in the case of Siraj, in a way, where the Jagat Seth of the time, Jagat Seth Madhav Rai, who was the reigning Jagat Seth, was insulted by Siraj. So goes the story, according to Indian historians or chroniclers, if you will, if not historians, as well as company records, East India Company records, that Siraj squeezed the equivalent of, wanted about the equivalent of 3 crores of rupees at that time, 30 million rupees, and to finance his battles and his treasury. And as the treasurer, as the bankers to Bengal, he expected Jagat Seth to cough up. They denied and he insulted Seth Madhav Rai, Jagat Seth Madhav Rai, in court, in public, which the Seth never could forgive. And that actually led him to coalesce, to become an active part of the Murshidabad conspiracy. The Jagat Seth, I don't think, really bankrolled the conspiracy, because if you look carefully, you had independent, wealthy people. I mean, after all, the key conspirators were the elites of Murshidabad. Ghazeti Begum was an extremely wealthy person in her own right. I mean, the fabulous palace of Moti Jheel was, after all, built for her by her husband, Nawaz Muhammad Khan. And she inherited immense wealth. And she had her own private army, and she had immense wealth even after Siraj sequestered much of her wealth. Mir Jafar was a noble of long standing. He was independently wealthy. Rai Durlabh Ram was a noble. He held land. He was not a poor man. These people didn't really need money from Jagat Seth. They needed Jagat Seth, someone as powerful as Jagat Seth, as a power broker who invested in the future of Bengal, for his own personal interest. And why? To secure his own future, secure the future of the banking family, secure the future of the Seth family, the banking family, in perpetuity or as close to perpetuity as possible. So at that point of time, the Jagat Seth Madhavrai also and his cousin Swarup Chand took a calculated decision to actually throw their lot in a subtle way with the British East India Company, as opposed to the French East India Company, which the Jagat Seth, which I detail this whole episode in my book in much detail, to break another myth about the Battle of Plassey, that they decided that the French were not going to be effective people in the future as far as they were concerned. So they sided with the British. And when the French representative Jean Law came to treat on behalf of the French company, they actually told them to go away. It wasn't going to work for them. And Jagat Seths were on board already with the Plassey conspiracy. It was a cold, calculating business decision to secure their future, to secure the future of the banking family for the economic and political stability of Bengal and Eastern India as they saw it.
Mr. Aryan Chaudhary has a question which I think it might be on many people's minds. He asks, how much did Sirajuddaular's personal disposition have to do with the dislike that the people of Bengal in general and conspirators in particular had for him? For instance, his supposedly excessive debauchery, proclivity for cruelty, etc. It is almost as if the British East India Company was the lesser evil. Do you go along with this, or do you want to
come? Well, thank you for asking that question, and I'm very glad you did, because it's one of the enduring myths of Plassey, and this allows me to quickly ride this question. Thank you very much for asking it, to break another little myth, or another large myth, if you will, as to how Siraj is portrayed. Now, Siraj's debauchery is recorded by people of the time, that he drank a lot and he was sexually extremely active, and he was also bisexual, which is not a bad thing in many people's minds. Many people were and have been for hundreds of years, possibly thousands of years in our system, in our social system. So it's not a new thing for us. And so Siraj was credited or discredited as to sort of with his band of boys, if you will, the sort of the grandees of the young thugs of Murshidabad would sort of walk around the streets of Murshidabad and pick boy and girl, man or woman that caught his fancy, and would debauch with them simply because he was the beloved of Alivardi Khan, who was the Nawab of Bengal. Point one. Two, he was a complete alcoholic. He was given to drink. Three, that he was so cruel that he was said to rape women. He was said to go on the Bhagirathi and the Ganga and watch boatloads of men, women, and children, boys and girls, be deliberately drowned in the river, so to see them flailing and drowning for his sort of vicarious and sort of visceral pleasure. Now that, ladies and gentlemen, is I think is could be close to bunkum because of two counts. One is that the entire episode is dependent on the telling of this Frenchman, Jean Law. Jean Law's accounts of Siraj's cruelty, which doesn't find mention in any other source of the time, and which sources subsequent to that time repeatedly referred to, and over these centuries has become the truth in many minds. It goes back to that one source, the statement by Jean Law, and Jean Law himself doesn't offer any eyewitness verification. He doesn't offer anything at all. That one day I was by the riverbank and I saw the Nawab of Bengal, the Prince of Bengal, sort of clap his hands in glee in drunken revelry while he watched people drown. There's nothing of that sort. So I'm not sure about how cruel that was. And would Alivardi Khan, who was a wise man in his own way, was battling the Marathas at that point of time, wanted to maintain stability, would he, who also advocated sort of happy citizenship or happy companionship, revenue companionship with his subjects, the riots at that time, would he allow his beloved grandson to upset the socio-economic, the socio-political equation with his subjects of Bengal by letting this boy run rampant and creating enormous bad blood and problems for his own administration, which nobody at that particular time, including local sources of the time, referred to as happening. They all refer to that one source. And so I'm not sure how true this grand villainy of Siraj is. I will concede that he was a jittery man. How many 23-year-olds, when they become Nawabs, how many postgraduate students of the present day at age 23 will be dealing with the geo-economic and geopolitical impulses that were brought upon him when he became Nawab, with the conspiracy in Murshidabad, with defeating the British twice over, taking the battle to them in Calcutta, taking the battle to them in Plassey and almost winning it, is not a sign of a foolish man necessarily. It is a sign of a man, or boy man, an impetuous boy man, I'll grant you that, a jittery, nervous boy man who nevertheless had the presence of mind to desperately try and balance the British with the French. It didn't work out for him. That's another story. That is the story of Plassey. But I don't think he was quite the idiot that he's made out to be. He's quite the good for nothing that he's made out to be.
All right, the last three questions that I'll bother you with. One is a contemporary one. This is from Koshin.
And sorry to interrupt, but maybe after, if you don't mind, ladies and gentlemen, after taking this question, let's not waste the opportunity to have the battle map, if you will.
In fact, the next question is about the map, so maybe you can take that as a springboard.
Wonderful, thank you.
But this question
thank you
isn't.
very much.
Right, but this question isn't. It's a contemporary question. It is from a gentleman named Kaushik. How is it that well after the departure of the British, our textbooks continue to carry the English version of the battle and its lead up to it? Having left school several decades ago, has this since been corrected or has it been left to stand?
Thank you for asking that. I think it is in various stages. The British telling was in effect replaced by the British telling actually also sort of post Black Hole, post Holwell began to gather momentum, and then you had sort of the grand whitewashing, or what I would call the grand Clive washing of Plassey and its aftermath, which British company and Crown chroniclers undertook very robustly. And the peak of it, if you will, I think happened with Macaulay and many other chroniclers and historians after him. It was almost de rigueur to build it up. What happened as a result of that? And you had people, like Sir Jodunath Sarkar, and even before Sir Jodunath, you had Bengal historians from Bengal, or aware people from Bengal, who the literate people from Bengal, who actually ironically came out of the so-called Bengal Renaissance in the early 19th century and the mid 19th century. They began to question, much like many other aspects of British colonial aspects, they began to also question Plassey to some extent. Not everybody did. To the reality of actually of what went down. Now, after the British left, and the early part of with Sir Jodunath and Indian historians that followed, it began to be replaced, if you will, by a sort of an Indian nationalist version of how the Battle of Plassey played out, which began to sort of India wash the Plassey episode. So sometimes it went to the other side, and with Bengali historians in particular, or Bengali nationalist historians in particular, you also had a lamentable Bengali wash that was beginning to happen, where Plassey began to be portrayed in certain quarters as having been a battle with the British fought with the Mussalmans of Bengal. So you had the Mussalman rulers of Bengal, which were defeated by the British, and thank God they did it, because these Yavanas, the Jawbons that had been ruling Bengal for these several hundred years, were finally dispelled and defeated by the British, and we got our own land back, and glory to the Crown and Company. So you had that creeping in as well, which was, again, which was not a very happy thing. And one of the key aspects of that began to happen. Was the pinnacle of that actually was this grand epic poetry which was published in 1875 called Polashi Juddho by Nobin Chandra Sen, which was an outright Clive washing of the Battle of Plassey, where he even imbues Clive being visited by the vision of Britannia on the eve before Plassey. It is a brilliantly written poem, but it is from a historical perspective. It is whatever Chandra Babu was smoking at that particular point of time, or taking, imbibing with his shura and moddopan and his afim, possibly in the evening, and his sort of pandering to the crown elements at that point of time. I want to know what he was smoking and drinking at that point of time as he wrote this fabulously worded epic poem. Now, that when it went away, was replaced by the Indian nationalist perspective, which nationalized, if you will, the Battle of Plassey. And that has come to be, again, sort of almost unilaterally enforced by the official Indian educators, whatever that means, which finds its place in Indian school books, which finds its place in Indian college texts, and all power to teachers and to lecturers and to professors who question these unilateral histories, if you will, the sort of whitewashing of histories, the so-called incorrect histories or emotional histories or biased histories or political histories, and question them to try and construct a multifaceted history, which history really is, what I've tried to convey in my book as well, a sort of a multifaceted history, and look at those truths. So I think the time has come now, and increasingly the various sort of solid or official versions of histories are being increasingly questioned. And I'm very, very happy, I for one, and I'm extremely happy that it's happening.
All right, the next question, as I had, excuse me, told you earlier, it's in fact relates to the map, which is up on everybody's screen. It is from Mr. Otanu Kaur. He says, in the map, I don't see any reference to Mohanlal and his position in the deployment of the Nawab's army. So I guess that's his question. Where is Mohanlal's army?
Okay. Well, to use a word, a phrase in Latin, mea culpa, if I may go that far, which is basically that I've taken this map, which was one of the most simple and effective maps, from the depiction of a map that Clive himself was believed to have sketched with other Crown and Company sources of the battle at that time, and I kept it simple. So Mir Madan was actually leading. Mir Madan is there, and Mohanlal is there, not there. And since you asked about Mohanlal, who was a general in the loyalist Bengal army, you will find another name missing as well, Nawe Singh Hazare, who was also martyred on the battlefield of Plassey on that day, which is held up as a martyr by the Bengali nationalist historians, or the people who would like to believe remember Plassey as a dark day in the history of Bengal. So it has been kept as simple as possible. So you have the Plassey field, you have the mango grove, the famous mango grove. There are very few mango trees, ladies and gentlemen, there right now, if it interests you. You have the Nawab's army, and you have Mir Jafar, Yar Latif Khan, and Rai Durlab Ram, the sort of the traitorous generals, if you will, who stood neutral in the battlefield of Plassey. And if you see the Plassey, you'll see an arrow to the bottom right, which shows you where north is. That is where Murshidabad is to the north. And of course, the south of that is Katwa and downriver, the Hooghly Bhagirathi. So you have the setting of the battlefield where you have the British who have, if you can see that there's a defensive perimeter set around the mango grove where Clive positions his troops. You have the cannons, you have the artillery field pieces. Behind them, you have the infantry. And then on the eastern aspect, you have more infantry and some cannon, not so too few to depict over here, and that are ranged against the forces of the Bengal forces, what ended up being the neutral Bengal forces. Opposite them, you have the loyalist forces of Bengal, where you have a feature you can see, which is called Tank 1, which was basically where the battle, when the battle began at 8 a.m. on 23rd of June 1757, that was the position of Siraj's forces, the loyalist forces, around that tank number 1, behind which you see another feature called tank number 2, where were arrayed a mix of forces in which Mohanlal belonged, in which Nawaz Singh Hazari belonged. They were leading their own troops, and behind which you have a mound, a hillock, which is there, and behind which you have a barrier, which was again an earthwork, and then you have Siraj's camp in relative safety at the back of the battlefield. So that is essentially the play of the battlefield as we begin in the morning. The battle begins, and you see here, I mean, you know the story as to what happened, that there was the story goes, and it is recorded by everybody, the British historians as well as Indian historians, that it was the middle of the monsoons. The monsoons were in terrific play by then. Both Clive's army and the company army and the Bengal army had squelched through muddy tracks and fields for several hours to reach their respective positions in Plassey/Plassey. And when the battle began, this was the position. And the battle, when it began with the great advantage going to the Bengal army. And they moved steadily. The gap that you see between the Crown Company forces and the Bengal forces was filled by the Bengal forces. They moved steadily southwards towards Clive's forces, which led to great concern. In fact, the first casualty, the first shot was fired by Siraj's army, the loyalist army, and the first casualties accrued to Clive's army. And the cannonading followed, continued to the Bengal army's advantage. And then you had that epic moment, if you will, when there was a good downpour, and you have that grand, the submission that the gunpowder or the ammunition of the Bengal army got dampened by rain. It was not effectively protected. And Clive's forces, by virtue of being camped in the grove, had their gunpowder relatively protected and relatively dry. They would subsequently be able to return more efficient rates of fire back at the Bengal forces, and which began to drive the advantage slightly towards Clive. All through this, ladies and gentlemen, Mir Jafar, Yar Latif Khan, and Rai Durlabh's forces did not move a muscle. They stayed where they was. And if you see the position on the battlefield, you can imagine that why Clive was so nervous, which I read out to you before the notes. Because if you can see from the position that if Mir Jafar and his colleagues decided, and they were clearly playing the waiting game, that the battle was going to go Siraj's way, you can see how easily they could have swept in from the northeast and the southeast and absolutely overwhelmed the company forces, which totaled a maximum of 5,000 to an estimated 10 times that number of the Bengal forces, loyal and disloyal, and they could have swamped it. So you can just see how the battle plan shows you how much it was affected. Now Mohanlal, and the second key moment, I'll wrap it up very quickly. This point, the second key point development happened when the British cannonading had greater efficacy, showed greater efficacy towards the afternoon after the downpour, which was at 12 noon or so. Then a cannonball struck Mir Madan, who was a key leader of the forces, and he bled to death, which led Siraj to panic because Mir Madan, as sources say, died at the feet of his Nawab. Siraj at the point of time reached out to Mir Jafar, and the grand mythical or semi-mythical or apocryphal event, saying he took down his turban, put it at Mir Jafar's feet, and said, "Save my turban, save me, and look after me as you did my grandfather." And Mir Jafar said, "Nothing doing, no deal. I suggest you go back, call off the battle for the day, retreat, call off the battle, end the battle, move back, and we shall fight another day." At which point of time, word went out to Mohanlal, and Nawaz Singh Hazari had died in the meantime, which led to greater panic in the British forces. All through this, Mir Jafar and company stayed still. And Siraj sent word to Mohanlal to retreat. Mohanlal couldn't believe it. Even the British, subsequently, they realized they couldn't believe it either, because that began the retreat of Siraj's forces, which in some disarray, which was followed by Mir Jafar's forces, because he had to follow through with what he told Siraj. He would retreat for the day from the battlefield. And what began as gradual retreat, which was followed up by Clive's forces, who kept moving steadily northwards to take on this tremendously surprising advantage, which they never expected to have. And what began as a gentle retreat became a rout. And by 6 o'clock that evening, the Battle of Plassey was over, ladies and gentlemen. It was as bizarre and as simple, or as not as simple as that.
Right, and this is the last question, and suitably forward-looking. From Mrs. Shupriya Goswami, are you working on any other revisionist research projects right now?
Oh, good Lord, revisionist, is it? I'm now a revisionist.
Well, means it in a very congratulatory sense.
Well, Rudramshuda permits me. I will say that maybe I'm a practitioner of corrective history, if you will, if I may be permitted to even sound as lofty and grand as that. The way I look at history, and I'm an absolutely passionate student of history for the longest time, I wouldn't dare to call myself a historian. I will try to call myself a writer of history. I'm a graduate of history, but leave that aside for the moment. As a writer of history, as a conveyor of history, I would like to look at history not, if I say revisionist, it is in a way a corrective stance that I take, where I look at multiple sources and I look at all available sources, try and break myths, try and look through all the whitewashing, gauge primary and secondary and tertiary sources for what they are, and then construct a narrative to bring to practicing historians, to academicians, to students, and to general readers and lovers of history as to what I believe this pivotal moment in history to be. And it is an entirely pivotal moment, which William unfortunately doesn't acknowledge. If it's revisionist, so be it. Let me be revisionist with William Dalrymple. And here I'm treading into deeply shark-infested waters, and that is about as revisionist and foolhardy, if I may, or corrective history oriented I might get. See what happened from Plassey. You had the company taking firm control of Bengal, the court of Bengal, the treasury of Bengal. They began to, and the administration of Bengal. You had, they took 3.4 million pounds in 1757 pounds sterling as a fee for their coup and as a fee to put Mir Jafar on the throne, which then, when Mir Jafar couldn't cope with the demands of the company, they brought Mir Qasim in, because Mir Jafar is actually the guy who conspired with the Dutch, which led to the Battle of Chinsura. When that secret was out, company deposed Mir Jafar, got Mir Qasim, his son-in-law, in, for which they took another fee. When Mir Qasim couldn't handle it, they got rid of Mir Qasim and brought Mir Jafar back for yet another fee, and to the Crown and Company and the executives. Then you had the deposing of Mir Qasim. You had the Battle of Buxar in 1764, where you had the company forces led by Hector Munro actually defeating the forces in which Mir Qasim was a participant, and the paper tiger emperor, who was Ali Gauhar, the Prince Ali Gauhar, who later became Shah Alam II, was there. He was defeated. Meantime, the heft of Bengal allowed the company to move westwards towards Awadh, took Awadh, they captured Awadh. In 1765, they pressured Robert Clive, who had returned from Britain after getting his peerage, becoming the heaven-sent general, and Clive Baron Plassey came back in May 1765. In the Treaty of Allahabad, literally led the emperor by the hand, the same way that he led Mir Jafar by the hand to the Masnad of Bengal in 1757, on 29th of June 1757, and got the Treaty of Allahabad signed, which gave the Diwani of Bengal to the East India Company, and which unleashed huge financial resources for the company, which also led, unfortunately, directly led to the famine of 1770, unfortunately, where 10 million people in Bengal died. Short point is Plassey allowed this domino effect to take place, which ultimately led the British to move to Delhi and in 1803, get rid of the rampaging Marathas, take over control of the Mughal Empire, and in 1857, and in the meantime, affecting the permanent settlement, the subsidiary alliance, you name it, it happened. 1857, you had the mutiny or the War of Independence, and company moved to Crown in an official sense. It all begins, ladies and gentlemen, with the Battle of Plassey on 23rd of June, 1757. I cannot stress the importance of this event. It would be foolish on the part of any historian or a student of history, revisionist or visionist, or otherwise or visionary or otherwise, or plain stupid or plain clever, to dismiss the import of the Battle of Plassey, of Palashi Juddha.
That brings us to the end of today's talk. May I now call upon my colleague in the library committee, Professor Chaitali Mitra, to deliver the vote of thanks, please. Brodash, please unmute her, if you can.
Sir, I can't find her in my list, please.
Oh, well, all right. Anyway, thank you, Sudeep, so much for spending so much time with us. It's a pleasure. It's a joy in these very dark times to be spending time on such things as you have just spoken about. And thank you to the whole audience. It was quite a substantial audience, and thanks also to the Bengal Club staff who have worked behind the scenes to make this happen. So thank you very much. Good night. Please stay safe.